You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 215. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Have you ever been told that you're too quiet, too shy, that you should speak up more, speak louder, that you should stand taller? If you feel like you are an introvert who is being pressured to be more of an extrovert in order to thrive socially, professionally, or in some other aspect of your life, then this podcast episode is for you. Thank you for joining me. I am excited to have you here today. Excited in my own introverted way. The reason that we're talking about this today is that last week I attended a course on public speaking, and it brought up for me some memories about being nudged in the direction of extroversion when I am pretty sure that I am more of an introvert. And I'll tell you the story because it's relevant here. And what I'm hoping to impart today is that if you're an introvert, you do not need to transform yourself into an extrovert in order to be successful as a lawyer, as a person in a social world, or in any other area of your life. And so we'll dive into that. And I'm going to start with the story. So there I was taking my online course for presenting more effectively. And it was a great course. There were only a handful of people in this 3-hour workshop. And at one point, the instructor asked each of us to prepare and speak about a topic, very short, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And at the end of each of our presentations, she delivered feedback, which I really appreciated. I love when someone else gives you their impression of something that you have just done. It's really useful. And her feedback was, for the most part, good, kind, nice. I enjoyed hearing it. But part of it stuck with me, and here's the part I'll share with you. She used the words calm and warm as describing the presence that I had as a speaker. And then she asked me, she said, "Are you an introvert?" And she didn't say it so much like it was a bad thing, but she didn't say it so much as a good thing either. And when I confirmed that, yes, I probably am an introvert, she said, yeah, and we should probably think about ways to bring more energy into your presentation. So she might have said something else. I don't really remember, but the way that she said it reminded me of a conversation that I had 20 years ago. Yes, 20 years with a well-meaning mentor, a gentleman who himself was actually relatively mild-mannered, and he was trying to give me constructive feedback. And his feedback for me was, Paula, you know your stuff, and I'd like to see you be more confident. And confident, as he described it, was, stand taller, put your head up high, throw your shoulders back, chest out, and speak louder. And this stuck with me because at the time I had heard that type of feedback before, be more confident. And yet I was puzzled because I didn't know how to do that. So having these physical cues, I could do that, speak louder, stick my chest out, whatever. But it didn't really resolve confidence. And I've talked about that a lot on the podcast before. And the part of it that I want to talk about today is that it didn't really take into account that my personality is not a person who goes around talking really loud with my chest out. And if I try to be that person, I'm going to be struggling really hard to be that person day to day. And what I would much rather do and become, and this is what the feedback I received last week really crystallized for me, is I would much rather be a really effective introvert than a kind of halfway there extrovert. So if you can relate and you'd like to learn more about how you can do this, you're in the right place. We're going to do that today. Now, before I dive into that, I did want to mention I am opening up, or I have opened up a group coaching program for women lawyers that starts in July. My guess is that when this podcast episode goes live on July 2nd, I will have capacity for more women to join that group. So if you want a space where you'll be in an environment with up to 7 other women lawyers, I'm capping the group at 8, please let me know. You can reach out. There will be a link on the page that hosts this recording of the podcast where you can learn more about the program, or you can reach out to me directly. Either way, I'd love to chat with you about it. It is a group that is suitable for introverts and extroverts. And it's a place where you can spend the next 6 months working on goals that are important to you in your practice, whether they are job transitions, whether it's stepping into leadership, whether you're returning from a mat leave, whether you are preparing for a mat leave, whether you want to dial up your practice management. So if you're intrigued by that idea of working on your goal in community with other women lawyers, with me as your coach, please do reach out if we're still in early July 2025. Now, back to what we're talking about today. We're going to cover this in 3 different sections. The first is to look at what it means to be an introvert or an extrovert or an ambivert. Maybe you've heard that term before. And some questions to help you assess where you are. And maybe as you're listening, you already know you are squarely in the introvert camp, or maybe you're squarely in the extrovert camp. And extroverts, you are also welcome. You are absolutely welcome. Hopefully this episode will help you learn more about yourself and also maybe understand the introverts in your life a little bit better. I will address in the second part of this episode some common misconceptions about introverts. And then finally, I'm going to offer you some tips, some practical strategies for being an effective lawyer and networker as an introvert. A few tips there. So delighted to have you with me today. Let's get started. So the first question that we're going to address is, how do you distinguish between an introvert and an extrovert, and what exactly are you? So the term introvert and extrovert was coined by Carl Jung, Jung, back in 1921. He is a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, or he was, I should say. So along with chocolate and watches and trains that run on time, we can credit the Swiss with these lovely terms. Now, I'm going to talk more about introverts and extroverts. There's also this concept of an ambivert. And an ambivert is someone who falls somewhere on the spectrum between being a full introvert or a full extrovert. And that can change. Your traits or the way you would identify can change depending on a situation. Now, in surveys, the number of people, the population percentage that identifies as introverted is in the range of 30 to 50%, depending on the study. So if you're an introvert, you are absolutely not alone. And I experience this in my capacity as a coach. I'm often asked by lawyers, I'm an introvert. How do I thrive in a networking situation? It's a fairly common question. So I know a lot of you out there are introverts, and it's not just in a networking context that you might have questions about how to thrive. It may also be in your work context. I mean, I've worked in law firms. I've worked with lots of different lawyers. I've seen lots of different personality types. I mean, it's not just lawyers who may be introverted or extroverted. And so you can see how extroverts may really thrive and excel and attract a lot of attention. And so we sometimes focus more on them. And yet there's also these introverts who are highly effective and in their own ways very successful and different. And so that's what we're talking about today. So what are some key differences between introverts and extroverts? So introverts, and I'm going to offer 3 main categories of ways to distinguish between an introvert and an extrovert, and some questions you can ask yourself. So the first area of distinction that I'll talk about is the idea of energy and how you gain your energy. So if you think about yourself like a cell phone and you've got a battery bar, your battery charges, it wears down. And for introverts and extroverts, the way that you would restock that fuel is quite different. So introverts typically need alone time in order to recharge. So they gain their energy from quiet time. That might be just time alone, vegging, watching TV, reading, walking somewhere quiet. But you need that time alone in order for your batteries to go back up. Whereas an extrovert typically recharges by being around other people. So they need to get out and interact with other humans, and they gain their energy from social interactions, from chit chat, from going to social events. And if you're an introvert and you know extroverts, I imagine that there are people coming to mind for you where you can absolutely see how this happens. So if I give you a personal example, I'm more introverted. I'm probably an ambivert, but I'm more introverted than my husband, for example. So for me, I love having quiet time in the morning so that I can journal and think about my day and plan everything out and know what I'm going to be doing hour to hour. And I refuel on that. And yes, I enjoy social situations, but if I'm going to the grocery store, I don't really stop and try to find people to talk to along the way. I kind of enjoy my quiet time. I might listen to a podcast. Versus my husband, who is much more extroverted. And so he likes to be around other people. He seeks out a lot more social engagement. If he goes to the grocery store, it will take him longer because he'll be stopping and chatting with everybody along the way. So all of the neighbors know my husband. He is a lot more social than I am during the pandemic. It was interesting because I work primarily from home, and that suited me quite well. He works in an environment where he's face-to-face with people all day. That worked really well for him. And you could really start to see, though, where the pandemic closures shut things down. I could see how he struggled more with that than I did, in the sense that I was quite content to be having a relatively quiet life at that point. So the first question you might ask yourself if you're trying to figure out where you fall on the spectrum is, how do you feel about social interactions generally? So if you were to go to a long social event, would you feel more energized or would you feel more drained? And if you would feel drained after that, chances are you're an introvert. And if you would feel energized by that, chances are you're an extrovert. And this isn't necessarily a hard and fast 100% of the time, because I would certainly identify as an introvert more so than an extrovert. And yet there are times when social engagements really charge my batteries. They get me really excited, really energized. And there are a number of social engagements where it is the absolute opposite. I see them on the calendar. I dread them. I feel exhausted afterwards. And so I don't think you can say 100% one way or the other. So you'll want to think about overall, are you more energized? Are you more drained? And how much alone time do you feel like you need in order to recover and be ready for that next social event? So you might want to space them out a little bit more. Now, the second area that we're going to focus on. So that first one is, where do you get your energy? The second one is, how do you think and act? And for introverts, the general tendency is to be reflective and inward focused. So you like to process your thoughts internally before you speak or before you act. And chances are you're a little bit less comfortable to speak off the cuff, to do things that are more spontaneous, take more risks, and you tend to work really well in independent or quiet work environments. So you might think about how that would apply to you in a work context. And I'll ask you a couple of questions. Well, actually, I'll just ask them now. So for example, if you're at work and someone gives you a new project, is your instinct to go and try to talk to a bunch of people about that new project? Or are you more likely to take your work with you to your office or some other location and think about it, read, think, reflect before you start seeking out input or conversation with others? And if you like to think first, chances are you're more of an introvert than an extrovert. You might also think about meetings. So if you're sitting in a meeting with a group of lawyers or your client or some other engagement where there's multiple people there and you have an opportunity to speak or there is something that you want to say, if you naturally speak up, if you volunteer your ideas without hesitation, then chances are you're more of an extrovert. Whereas if you like to have more time to sit and reflect and process before you speak, chances are you're more of an introvert. So that's a way of gauging where you fall on the spectrum. And again, it might change depending on the situation that you're in. You might find in some environments, the conversation flows really easily. You're really quick to volunteer your ideas. Whereas in other environments, you really want that time and space to think things through before you say anything. Now, the interesting thing about extroverts, and so if you're an extrovert listening to this episode, this will relate or resonate with you potentially, is that extroverts tend to process their thoughts verbally by speaking out loud and engaging quickly in conversation about their thoughts and ideas. And I've seen this a lot in my coaching practice. So what happens there, because I coach introverts and extroverts, and it's not necessarily something we talk about, but I reflected on it in preparing for today. There will be times where I will be coaching who I think is probably an extroverted lawyer, and they will tell me a story. They will use a lot of words, and I am delighted to be their audience, to listen, to pay attention to what they're saying. And what I find so magical is that by speaking, they process their thoughts out loud and they arrive at conclusions. And it can be really amazing to watch someone tell me that they really have no idea what they want to do next. And then I ask them some questions, which, by the way, is an introverted quality. For those of you who are introverts, you tend to ask really good questions. So I will ask some questions, which will lead to the introvert sharing what's on their mind. And often that thing that they thought they didn't really have a clue about what they were going to do, they've actually got a plan. And it crystallizes through conversation. So for the extroverts out there, you're processing your ideas verbally. And that is really effective for you. Now, what's interesting is if you're an introvert and you have extroverts in your life, you might find that you get really tired because when people are talking, you're listening. And so you're burning a lot of energy following the conversation, trying to capture the information, picking up on all of the nuances. And the extrovert might be there talking and conversing. And you might find that you get tired because you're working so hard to listen and they're getting really energized by the conversation. They're reaching their conclusion. At the end of it, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. So this might happen to you. It happens to me. And it might help just to understand that. And it's not that you don't want to be around that person or that you don't want to hear the conversation. It's just understanding that there might be energy dips. The way that energy is being consumed and created might be different, which might explain, it's not so much that you don't want to see that person, but you just want to know this is what's happening with your energy. So maybe you prepare for that. Maybe you know that you'll need a bit of downtime after a visit with your really extroverted friends. It's not necessarily a mismatch in who you are as people, but in the way that you are made up, your extrovert, introvert settings. Now, extroverts also typically tend to thrive in high stimulation settings. So if I think of my husband, he's always wanting to be on the go. And for him, most of our family, my daughter is pretty good at getting out there. My son is more reserved. And so I think he's had to accept that if he really wants to go on those road trips, he loves driving a car. I think it's the motion, it's the excitement, all of that. But for the rest of us, we're a little bit less extroverted than he is. And so he needs to find that stimulation in other ways. And so for you, whether you're an extrovert thinking about how you can balance your needs with your introverted friends' needs, or if you're an introvert thinking about, okay, well, that makes sense. That makes sense why my extroverted friends always want to be doing these things. Then you can plan and prepare for it. You understand it. And again, going back to my own disposition, I do like high energy. I do like high stimulation activities, but I also know that I have my limits and I need to be kind of conscientious about how I do that. And so finally, that brings us to social situations. And this is where I think introverts can often be mistaken for overly shy, maybe snobbish, maybe unfriendly. And it's because introverts often appear quiet. They may appear reserved, often when they're in large groups or unfamiliar environments where you're still kind of trying to assess the lay of the land. You're trying to figure out who's who and how people operate and how you would enter the conversation. Typically, introverts would prefer these more deeper conversations over small talk. So introverts will often say to me, I just don't want to do the small talk. I don't like small talk. And I think that's one of those areas where we don't need to become extroverts. However, I think there is value in creating rapport. And sometimes rapport is more easily created when we can engage in what we might consider small talk. So, for example, when I write emails, I will often want to dive straight into the meat, the substance of what we're talking about. And if we're halfway through an email chain, that's probably okay. But I will often write an email and then review it to see if I should put something in that email to create a more friendly tone, to build rapport in my email. And I try to do this in-person dialogue as well. So one thing I've noticed actually is I do a lot of Zoom calls. And one of the ways that we seem to be establishing rapport these days is that initial tech kerfuffle that often happens at the beginning of a Zoom call where someone's speaker isn't working or their earphones aren't working. And so you have this little, okay, let's get ourselves settled. What's going on with the tech? So it's kind of this funny little banter over tech. And so that might be the small talk, but then that serves to build a bit of rapport before you dive into the topic. Whereas as an introvert, you might just want to get straight in there. I know I do. So again, that might just be introverted characteristics. You may prefer deep conversations over small talk. So I know this is true for me. I tend to find medium-sized groups to be a bit awkward because often the conversation will kind of just flow in a way that I have a hard time getting attached to the thread of the conversation. It depends on the group. Whereas if I'm in a conversation with one or two people, then we can channel the conversation matter into something that is of interest to everybody in that group. And so if you can relate to that, it might be a sign that you are an introvert. Again, it's not that you don't like these people independently or don't have anything in common with them. It's that group dynamic may feel less energizing to you versus an extrovert who might really thrive in that environment. What you might find is that the extroverts typically like being the center of attention. So they'll thrive on the energy of being in that group and telling stories and telling jokes. I think of my maternal grandmother. She was definitely an extrovert and she would really create these engaging and hilarious stories. And she was always telling jokes and telling stories. And she was literally the life of the party. And so those are the extroverts. And if you're not an extrovert, then you might prefer to be, at least part of the time, in a smaller environment. Now, the other thing that you might find if you're an introvert is that you may be more selective about socializing in terms of who you like to socialize with. And because you enjoy it, but you need more time to recover, you might find that you're more particular about what you go to, who you want to speak with when you're there. Versus what I've observed in extroverts, which is that they don't necessarily care where they go. They just want to be around people. And they may be less fussed about who they talk to. They just want to talk to someone. That for them is energizing. So that might be another distinction. So questions that you could ask yourself, or a question you might ask yourself is, how do you feel about networking? If you think about networking, is it something that feels exciting to you? It's an adventure, in which case maybe you're more of an extrovert. Or is it something that you dread or you fear or you see as, setting yourself up for small talk conversations that you don't want to have? So in which case you'd be more of an introvert. That hopefully gives you a sense of the distinction between extrovert and introvert and helps you self-identify. And again, going back to that idea of ambivert, it can be different depending on the context. And so you don't need to be 100% one or the other, but chances are you tend more toward one to the other. So before preparing or as preparing for today, I decided to give myself a rating, and I would rate myself as a 3 to 4 on a spectrum. So if we've got introversion at 0 and extroversion at 10, I'm probably about a 3 or a 4. At times, maybe I would be more on the 5 to 6 range, but given where I'm at in my life, I work from home, I've got my young kids at home, I still want to spend a lot of time at home with them, doing quieter things. My work tends to be more quiet these days. It's punctuated by more social activities, but this is where I'm at these days, and maybe that would change. If I think of my extroverted friends, again, it depends on the friend, but some of them I think are a lot higher. If I think about my husband, I'd say he's an 8 or a 9 at the extroversion scale. And the idea here, again, going back to the theme, is you can be successful as an introvert and as an extrovert, as a networker. You don't have to be an extrovert to be good at networking. You don't have to be an extrovert to be an effective advocate. So I just want to say that because, again, that kind of goes back to the theme. So common misconceptions. This is the second part of today's episode. Some myths for all of you who may have views about extroverts or introverts. So myth number 1, introverts are shy, socially awkward, or lack confidence. The truth is many introverts are plenty confident. They are not socially awkward. They may not even be shy. They have a preference to not be as social. And a couple of famous introverts came up in my research for today. Audrey Hepburn apparently was an introvert, as is Meryl Streep, both of whom I admire as very fine actresses, and I would not describe either of them as socially awkward. To the contrary, I think they're both quite elegant and well-spoken. Myth number 2, introverts don't like people. Hopefully that has come through in what I've shared with you already. It's not that we don't like people as introverts, it's that we prefer that deeper connection, and we probably are going to be more selective about how we engage with others because of the way that it affects our energy levels. Myth number 3, I've got 5 myths altogether. Introverts can't be leaders. Again, not true. Whereas we may think of leaders as being these high charisma, high energy, loud personalities, that doesn't have to be the way. Many introverts can be excellent leaders. They often have great skills like being calm under pressure, thoughtful about others and the group, strategic in the way that they think. And a few great leaders came up again in my research. Bill Gates, Barack Obama, Mahatma Gandhi, all really effective leaders and very much a disposition that is more in the nature of introvert than extrovert. And sorry, extroverts, I'm not listing out extroverted leaders or examples because they tend to be more visible. And so I'm highlighting what we may not see. Number 4, introverts are antisocial. Now, I will often joke about being antisocial, but I am not antisocial. The reality is there are social situations where I absolutely thrive, and tends to be in smaller social situations where I feel a deep sense of connection with the people that I'm with. And it doesn't necessarily mean connection in the sense that we've known each other forever. Often, especially if I'm at a networking event or a social environment where I don't know people particularly well, is that we have something that is common in an interest. So for example, when I became a coach, I went through coach training and I was introduced. We had an in-person segment for the beginning of our training, and I met 41 other trainees, and the connections I formed with those people were very strong because we were all interested in learning how to become coaches. I found there were parallels there. I can recall my amazement, my first introduction to law school. I know some people have negative experiences when they start law school. I felt overwhelmingly delighted. I felt like I belonged. I felt like I was surrounded by people who were like me, who were thinking like me, who were kind of studious, who liked to read, who liked to think, who liked to talk. Not necessarily introvert, not necessarily extrovert, but I felt like a common connection. And so it made it exciting for me to go to social situations. As a law student, I used to host a lot of parties because I loved that connection. So even though I think overall I would tend to identify more as an introvert, I certainly loved, going back to the point, I certainly loved being with people. It wasn't so much that I was antisocial. And then finally, myth number 5, introverts always want to be alone. It's true. Introverts probably need some alone time, but they also enjoy being with other people. And again, I would consider myself a 3 to a 4 on the introversion scale. I have friends who I think are more introverted than me, and I need to manage my expectations of them because I know for them, socializing is draining. And so they need time to recharge. So I might have a larger appetite than they do for social events or how long we go out. And so that may be true for you as well, that you have people in your life who want more social time and some who want less social time as compared to you. So let's move on to the next and final section of today's podcast discussion, which is your strengths as an introvert and how you can be successful as a lawyer and networking. So just to recap, first of all, some of the common strengths associated with introverts, the ability to think deeply. When you are attracted to alone time, where you get to think and be thoughtful before acting and speaking, that gives you time to think deeply. So going back to Bill Gates, I watched a documentary a few years back about him. And one of the things that he does is Think Week. I think that's what it's called, where he basically gets a bunch of books together and goes and sequesters himself alone at this cottage and just thinks for a week. So that's the time where the ideas come. You probably have a similar experience. I know for me, when I'm out walking, I like time to myself. That's where I come up with my best ideas. Albert Einstein, again, a famous introvert who was well known for her thinking. And yes, I really like how I just sandwiched myself between Bill Gates and Albert Einstein. Strategic thinking is another strength often associated with introverts. Again, with that deep thinking, you are more reflective. So, for example, I do a lot of planning. And meal planning is one of my favorite things in the sense that I will plan out the weeks. I think about what's in the refrigerator. I think about what my kids will and will not eat. It really is a tough exercise. Believe me, if you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. When you have kids, if you don't have them already, you will learn. If you never have kids, don't worry about it. I'm sure there's other environments where you will be doing that strategic thinking. Everybody wants something different. There's allergies here and, what's easy. You can get it on the table on a work night, whatever. But I love the act of strategic planning. I love planning out the sequence of how things go in the oven, where, what goes in first? What do I start first? Whereas I've seen other people cook and they don't care. They just do whatever. And I'm like, we could do it so much more efficiently. So going back to the introvert extrovert, it's not that one is wrong and one is right because the meal will end up on the table either way. But as an introvert, you may have an ability to think strategically. So that could be a strength. And an example there is Warren Buffett. Again, a famous introvert who is clearly, obviously, very good at being strategic. Creativity. If you're an introvert with a very vibrant inner world, that might be a strength of yours. So J.K. Rowling is a very famous introvert. Susan Cain, if you've not yet heard of her, she has a fantastic TED Talk and a book about introverts. So I highly recommend looking into her work. If this is something that you are not familiar with, maybe start with a TED Talk because it's really easy to access and it's really good. And in preparing even for today, actually based on some of the feedback at my speaking course, I was doing some research about, who are effective public speakers, who are introverts. And she came up in my search and I listened to a great podcast episode where she talked about her process for preparing for her TED Talk, which involved a year's worth of training, really, getting herself out there, taking on every opportunity to speak, and learning a strategy that resonated with her introverted style as opposed to trying to be an extroverted speaker. So that was really fascinating. But she's obviously very creative. Susan Cain, J.K. Rowling. Introverts also tend to be excellent listeners. They tend to listen more than they talk. Not always true, but in some situations. You might find that other people feel really heard and seen and understood by you. If you're an introvert and you're giving people an audience, it is really effective, especially in today's world where people's attention is so distracted. Giving people an audience, giving them that space can be magical for them. And you pick up on details and nuances. So because you're paying attention, you're processing, you're thinking, and chances are you're thinking long after the engagement or the conversations you've had, you pick up on more nuances, more details, even after the fact. And then finally, staying calm under pressure tends to be an introverted trait. So you might find that things get really hairy. Maybe you're working on a case and a surprise comes along that is not a positive one, and everyone else is kind of flustered and panicky, and you have the ability to remain calm. And I spoke the other week about emotional contagion. It's a term I learned recently, the idea that your emotions can transfer to other people. So if you're the introvert, if you're the calm presence in the room, that can have a really positive effect on helping other people find their calm as well. So taking these strengths and looking specifically at you as a lawyer, what I would offer is to think about how you can excel. Going back to me 20 years ago, when my mentor told me, hey, Paula, you really should speak louder, throw your shoulders back. He was doing the best he could. That was the best advice he had. And I don't hold that against him. I'm sharing it because it's just an example of how people who mean really well may not be able to support you the way that you need or in a way that will really be effective. And so if you're thinking about yourself and you identify as an introvert and you want to feel powerful in a context where maybe you're surrounded by extroverts. As a former litigator, I saw so many extroverted litigators with a very extroverted style, and I felt like I needed to be more like them to be effective. And if I could go back to my 28-year-old self and say to her, hey, listen, there's another way we can do this. Here's what I would tell her. Here's what I would share with you is instead of being the loudest person in the room, be the most prepared. So think about the skills that you have, the ability to prepare really thoroughly, to think strategically, to maintain your focus and to maintain a deep focus. Use those skills to your advantage to be prepared. Now, when it comes to that showmanship of what we often consider an extroverted quality, this idea that you are kind of presenting yourself as the best, whether it's through the words that you're using or just because you're comfortable taking on the attention, instead of thinking you need to portray yourself a certain way to gain the confidence of others, whether it's other lawyers, whether it's your clients, instead, use your ability to ask questions and learn about other people to understand what it is that they actually want, what they actually need, and then deliver that to them instead. So hopefully this makes sense. If you think about a conversation with a client, instead of trying to tell your client, oh, well, you're in great hands because I've been doing this for so many years and, I win all of my cases and me. What if instead the conversation was, okay, listen, based on my experience, there are certain key considerations that we're going to want to address so that we can be as prepared as possible for whatever it is that you're doing. And then you ask them those questions and you want to make sure that you're gaining as much information from that person as possible so that you can respond to their wants and needs and be direct. I mean, this is something that I wish I had known as a lawyer. So I went through coach training after I really had decided to leave full-time private practice as a lawyer. And so unfortunately, I never really had the full opportunity to use my coach training as a lawyer. And I use my coach training in client-facing work that I do now. And what that means is that when I work with a client on a project, whether it's a speaking project or a coaching project or some other type of project, I love to ask questions about what they want, what they need, how they would define success, because how they define success, the outcome that they are seeking, might be different from the one that I would have guessed if I didn't ask all of those questions. And I think as a lawyer, it's hard for me to say exactly because everyone practices so differently. But as a litigator, there was a process. Okay, as a litigator, we need to follow the litigation process. Let's do our discovery. Let's do X, Y, Z. And yes, when you get to settlement conversations, for example, you might be getting really clear with your client what they want. But I'm not sure that I did as much asking as a lawyer as I would now, knowing what I know now as a coach about the importance of understanding what people want. And so that is something that you have the power to do as an introvert with your questions, with your inquisitiveness, your ability to listen and hear the nuances. You can, instead of trying to showmanship your way to credibility and trust and authority, you can actually do that through an introvert strength method. And then the third thing I'd offer here is instead of burning yourself out trying to be an extrovert. So again, this kind of goes back to that energetic difference. Like the lawyer who's telling me with good intention to be something that I'm not. If I had to run around all day yelling to prove myself, I would be exhausted. So instead, what about channeling your more natural, energetic state, which maybe is more calm generally? Maybe there's times where you are really excited, where you do speak really loud, where you meet the sort of quintessential definition of confidence. But if not, what about just embracing that energy and using your calm and composed nature to help other people around you feel safe, to feel heard, to feel connected? And, as I'm reflecting on this, I can think of a number of situations where people have felt really comfortable confiding in me because they know that it's a safe space to do so. They know that I will listen. And that could be a real strength, especially when it comes to leading a team or keeping a team together or being able to be a diplomatic presence in an organization where maybe there's some communication that's lacking between one group and another. And so think about how by not being the focus of attention, by not needing to be the center of attention, how that may actually be a strength for you as an introvert and how you can use that strength in order to be more effective as a lawyer in the work that you're doing. So those are the three suggestions that I have. Number one is instead of being the loudest person in the room, be the most prepared. Instead of trying to persuade the client that you're the best through showmanship, use your strength. Focus on the needs of the person you're with, whether that is a client, you're a sort of end user of legal services client, whether it's lawyers that you work with, potential referral sources, whether it's your colleagues, you want to focus on them. That is one of your strengths. And then finally, embracing your introverted self. Totally unrelated, but I'm going to my high school reunion in, I guess, less than a month now. And I'm celebrating my birthday today. I'm 48. And so I'm at this transition point in my life where I'm thinking back. And high school for me was a place where I felt like I really had to be an extrovert. Talk about being a lawyer extrovert. It starts young. There's a lot of social pressure in, I think, our Western society to be more of an extrovert. And it's funny because I've already decided that I don't need to see everybody at this high school reunion. I would love to, but I don't need to try to be the life of the party. I don't need to be the loudest person in the room. My goal for myself is simply to go and be myself and see what happens. And it can be liberating when you simply decide that you're going to step into an extroverted or an introverted persona, whatever resonates with you, and let that just be. So anyhow, I share that with you because hopefully it resonates with you. Maybe there are social situations where you just want to embrace your inner introvert. So let's do that. Now, speaking of social situations, I promised some tips on networking. So here they are. Number one, I say this because so many lawyers and law students struggle with this. And so if you struggle with this, you are in such good company. There are many of you. Again, going back to the statistics, 30 to 50% of people self-identify as introverts. So it's not like you're alone. You're in really good company. Now, the first thing I would recommend is to be selective about the networking that you choose to do. So think about events that you really like going to. Maybe you would prefer to do more lunches with 1 or 2 people or 3 people, maybe 3 would be an odd number, instead of larger events. Now, it could also be that you like larger events. I actually like both for very different reasons. But if I go to a larger event, I'm probably going to avoid mid-sized groups. That's my least favorite activity. And I don't love table seating. When you go to an event and you're all seated at a table and you're kind of stuck there, I don't love that. Even though I really love forming deep connections, I also really love being able to wander around a room. The adventurer in me likes to explore. And when my husband and I got married, we actually structured our wedding like that on purpose. We didn't have a sit-down dinner. Instead, we had a buffet, which I was watching a TV show the other day, and the mother-in-law was telling the soon-to-be mother-in-law was telling the son and soon-to-be daughter-in-law, whatever you do, don't have a buffet. So maybe it's gauche, I don't know, to have a buffet at your wedding, but we did that on purpose because for anyone whose wedding I've been to, I hope this isn't sitting the wrong way. I love all the weddings I've been to, but I love environments where I can get up and move around and mingle and come and go as I please. So for you, you might think about, okay, do you prefer a sit down? Maybe that's better for you because you like being at a table where you know who you're going to be sitting with and you like forming a deep connection with the person next to you. Maybe that works for you. Maybe you like the more controlled environment, or maybe you're more like me where you like the flexibility to get up and walk around a room and you see somebody that you really want to talk to and you go over in that direction or whatever it is. So think about what venue is most appealing to you. I also really love substantive learning. So for me, when I'm thinking about social networking events, I like to go to events where I'm going to learn something that I'm really interested in. That also increases the chances that the people that I'm going to meet there are going to be people with whom I have things in common, which helps me to establish connection. You might also think about when you attend events. Is there a particular time of day that is better for you? Do you have control over that? So again, you want to be discerning about what you decide to go to. Now, another little tip here, you might have the event, you might sign up for the event, and then on the day of the event, you do not want to go. Now, this is classic me. This happens to me most of the time. If I schedule a networking event for an evening, typically during the week, I will, and by week I mean like a weekday, a work day or a school day, I will dread going. Mostly for logistical reasons. It means I have to organize something for the kids. It means I have to drive somewhere. It means I have to get dressed and put on uncomfortable shoes most of the time. So I will try to talk myself out of it on the day of the event. It happens every single time. And now I know that about myself. So when that day rolls around and I try to convince myself, hey, Paula, that was a really dumb idea to schedule that thing because, blah, 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 the list goes on. I just ignore it 99% of the time. Sometimes I'll cave. But no, now I know this is part of the course, this is part of the program. So you might have a similar reaction. You might have this thing that you sign up for. You think it's a great idea. And then on the day of, you're like, oh, but I'm so tired. I need time to recharge, etc. My invitation to you is to simply not talk yourself out of it, to require that you do it. I get it. Energy levels, recharging. We've talked about that, but do require yourself to follow through with it. The next thing I recommend is to set goals about how many people you're going to speak with. And I want that goal to feel good to you. So I will recommend usually 2 or 3 people at a networking event that you have a meaningful conversation with. And you can define what meaningful means. It doesn't have to be really long. It just simply means connecting with other people. If you're trying to expand your network, it helps to do that. And what I find is if you're going to an event, especially if it's an event with a lot of people, it can feel overwhelming. So if the idea is, well, I'm going to go and network and you don't really have a plan, again, this goes back to my introverted planning ways. If you set yourself a modest goal, it feels doable. You can go to the event, you can talk to one person, you talk to the next person, maybe there's a third person, and then you're done. You can stay or you can go. You no longer have to stick around. You might find at that point that you feel good and you want to stay longer, you're having fun. Or you might decide, you know what, this is one of those days where I'm just going to go home. So set yourself a modest goal before attending the event And then finally, here, I would encourage you to think about how you can form deeper connections with fewer people, as opposed to trying to be everything to everyone. So you're great at asking questions. So you can use that skill to establish a rapport with people, to get to know them, to find interests that you have in common. You're a great listener, so you might give space to that person where they have a chance to talk about things that are on their mind, and they might really appreciate that about you. So again, that's forming that connection. So do that. And what you'll find out there, and I think this podcast episode will hopefully give you some guidance on thinking about who you're meeting. You're going to meet other introverts, people who are just like you, who are probably just as uncomfortable, or, they had to drag themselves out as well. And so maybe that's something you have in common. And maybe you find some extroverts when you're chatting with the extroverts, and you can hear about what's going on with them, and you can understand how the conversation is really energizing to them. It may not be as energizing to you, or maybe it is. Maybe you find that what they're talking about really resonates. So those are my tips for lawyering, for networking, ways that you can leverage your introverted strengths as opposed to trying to be an extrovert. So hopefully this has given you some ideas. Hopefully this helped you feel validated and appreciated and acknowledged and recognized as an introvert, if you're an introvert. And if you're an extrovert, hopefully you have a better understanding of the introverts in your life, that maybe the reason they don't want to go out isn't that they don't like you or they're antisocial or anything like that, but that it is simply a reflection of their wiring. So finally, just a quick recap. If you are an introvert, you are not alone. You don't need to pretend to be an extrovert to be successful as a lawyer, as a person in life, in social situations. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that there are a ton of resources for introverts out there. So again, that class last week kind of inspired me to do some digging on the internet. And there are podcasts for introverts. There are TED Talks for introverts. There are books for introverts, everything under the sun for introverts. So start doing some research if you're interested in this topic, and I guarantee you'll find some pretty cool stuff. You can start with Susan Cain if you want. There's some other great materials out there, of course, but amazing resources out there. So again, I mentioned at the beginning, I am offering a group coaching program and mastermind for women lawyers. Again, this I think would be a beautiful environment for you to work in community with other women lawyers on your goals between July and December of this calendar year. If you have any questions about that, reach out to me. I would love to have you. I structure the program in a way that I think is quite friendly to introverts and extroverts. I like to balance the group calls so that everybody has equal airtime, which I think is great for the introverts. They have an opportunity to speak up in situations where maybe they wouldn't otherwise speak up. So it can be a really good environment to really kind of force yourself to speak and to see how maybe you can even really enjoy it. So with that, I am going to wrap up today's conversation. I'm going to thank you for joining me today. It's been a wonderful opportunity to have you. I feel like I've really embraced my inner introvert today, which is a gift, again, given that it's my birthday. Yay! And thank you. It's been wonderful. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.